We're going.
All right. All righty, everybody. Afternoon time. So, our next keynote, Alex Cott, he's going to go through a bunch of stuff that's going to be really dope. And at the end of that, he's also going to be talking about the network CTF that's going on downstairs. Following that, we're going to go back to the bucket. So, be ready. Also, I just want to have do a little bit of a shout out to all of our Pittsburgh friends. BSides Pittsburgh. I know there's a couple of carpools that came up, and we really appreciate that. So thanks, guys. Okay, with that, everybody, our afternoon keynote, Alex Scott.
I think I might have turned this off. Can you hear me?
I can hear you through that.
Okay.
What's on?
Testing 1 to 3. Testing 1 to 3.
It's registering, but it's not doing it. Let's try that. Okay. Try the.
Is that off? That one?
You're good. You're good. That's all. Yeah. I muted it.
Testing 1 to 3. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So before I kick it off, a quick disclaimer. I'm going to talk about things, maybe legal, things related to my industry and healthcare, but I am not a legal expert or a healthcare professional per se. Feel free to always, reach out to your company internally for any type of legal advice. But I'll be going through things that I've experienced in my environment, and from there, hopefully, it helps out the InfoSec community out there. So the overall part of this talk will be kind of just to talk about how to improve the, hate to use the term, cybersecurity landscape. But the biggest problem that everyone has in this field is that there's no degrees, there's no certs or training to actually run a cybersecurity program. There's ones out there that'll talk about how to be a CISO, but none of those really work. There's so many pitfalls that you come across when it comes to understanding budgeting, working with executive leadership, and all the talks that are out there, they don't really work that well because fundamentally when we get into those situations, you have to kind of figure out those things out on the fly. So this talk is geared towards more people that are going to become security officers in the future, but additionally everyone, because I treat my employees the same way that I expect them to treat me. So I want them to, collaborate with me. I want them to tell me if I did wrong, and I expect other security officers out there. It's something that I really enjoy about this industry, which I haven't seen in many other places, that there's a lot of humble people out there. I mean, there's obviously here in the badges, well, not badges, but the wristband, so to speak, we encourage hugs and community collaboration, things like that, which isn't as common in other industries. So I feel like this is something that this industry needs to stick to and keep going that direction. And especially when you're up in the leadership roles, helping out the rest of the organization, you need to make sure, even during tough times, during incident response, to stay humble that whole time. All this material, free field to reuse, but what I talk about may work with you, may not, your mileage may vary, but really want to make sure the industry gets better from things that I've seen, so that you don't have to be one of those people where it's we take security very seriously. However, that type of scenario where that the leaders in the organization aren't able to work with the other leaders to kind of push that needle to build a proper cybersecurity program. So my title currently is the AVP of Cybersecurity at Aviana. We're the largest pediatric healthcare provider, which in the grand picture of it, we're still pretty small compared to the rest of the healthcare industry. We recently went public, so if you want to know about our financial information, it is out there on the internet now. The company is, especially if you read over the SEC statement, very rapid M&A. We've grown about double every year for the last 5 years, which is quite insane to most people, especially when you talk to other organizations about acquisitions and technical debt that acquire from that, but we were able to tackle a lot of that stuff. I worked in financial tech, particularly payment processing, retail, banking, healthcare. I'm an engineer by trade. I am not a manager or leader by any means, highly introvert, but what it comes down to is that if you have enough passion and you try to go into that, eventually you kind of overcome all those issues. So what I'm saying is that if anybody wants to actually be better in the industry and help out other people, doesn't matter if you're introvert like I am or, your people skills kind of suck, you'll be able to adapt and grow. And if I could do it, anybody else can. So speaking of titles, because I always refer to myself as I run the cybersecurity program at Aviana. I don't give myself a title per se. And that's one of the actual things that I want to talk about because I see this in a lot of other, you go into these CISO calls and stuff like that, and they'll have different titles, but I don't think they really understand the complications around that. So real quick show of hands. So everyone in this 1, 2, 3 are titled as CISO, like CISO Director of Security, CISO Chief Information Security, CISO VP of Security. And in there, I have a statement in there with how close they are to the board, whether it be to the CEO or whatnot. Who thinks number 1 is considered a CISO? What about number 2? Show of hands. Think they're a CISO? And then number 3, do they think that's a CISO? So the biggest problem is that I see a lot of people out there that are directors that consider themselves CISOs, but the problem is most organizations, in order to be a fiduciary of the organization, you have to have a VP title. Your signature doesn't really mean a whole lot. And when you're a director, you get in a little kind of a sticky situation signing off on stuff for the organization on behalf as a director, not a VP of the organization. So even though if you do communicate directly to the board, you got to be leery of that stuff. More of just to save your own butt in the future. But again, this is not legal advice. Please consult your legal team. But that's something that I see very common in the industry because, unfortunately, security is kind of a Band-Aid approach in most organizations. They patch it on after an incident, so they don't want to give a VP title in a lot of these companies. So then they're just putting this person in there for the time being, hoping they can fix all the problems. But you really need to be part of the executive leadership to kind of steer that and grow that part of the program. So let's talk about the state of cybercrime. Some numbers that definitely kind of make you kind of question if you want to stay on the good side because how profitable it is on the other side. But luckily, like I said at the beginning, a lot of the people in this industry are very humble. There's always work, so you're never going to have issues, finding jobs in cybersecurity. Additionally, we just have good codes of ethics. Hopefully, everyone in here. But data breaches are extremely expensive, especially when it comes to ransomware. A good one that happened recently was Universal Health Services. The biggest problem is that I would say probably less than 50% of ransomware instances actually go public. There's a lot of stuff that go under the radar that they're not legally obligated to disclose it. So to get numbers is hard because they're not always out there. Additionally, to get numbers of the operational impact, because ransomware is different than business email compromise. Ransomware, you'll have operational outages. You'll have potential customer losses, brand damaging, more so than a business email compromise. And I'll talk a little bit more about both of those in later on slides. But in here, they are particularly stated, which is a little bit more rare, on their SEC 10Q. So when you go public, you have to do 10Qs and 10Ks. And in there, you basically have to state financial significant damages that will affect the shareholders. And in there, they had to call out the fact that they had a 3-week outage from ransomware, and it resulted in $67 million of damages. Granted, they didn't have the number breakdown, so I don't know if that is, some of it's taken by cyber liability insurance, which I would say probably less than half, knowing how most of those things work. But it is an interesting thing because you don't realize it until it happens. And I would say this one particular I found very fascinating. If you would go on Reddit threads during this time, because they didn't really go public about it. I think it happened at like Sunday at 2 a.m. And then they didn't have a public statement until maybe either Tuesday or maybe Monday evening. But if you look at the Reddit threads, there's people in there saying that there's a computer outage. We had to transfer ER patients from this hospital to another one. We're not even sure if they're going to make it. So that fact is just, I hate to say it, for people that do things like this, for ransomware, for healthcare, for critical people out there, there's definitely a special place in hell for people that do things like that. But it really shows you the bigger picture of, the emotional state, the impact. And you could go on Reddit and view those threads at that time, and it definitely kind of shows that picture. And if you dealt with IR, you definitely see it, and just the IT staff and the executive leaderships too. The other thing is, which this number came out recently, this is the same group that did the Colonial Pipeline when the ransomware for about 4.4 million. Unlike what Bloomberg said, it was 4.4 million. The dark side, they tracked all the Bitcoin addresses to dark side. Total of 47 victims, and I think there's really only two major ones. It was like Colonial Pipeline and then some gas company in Germany. I'm sure there's other ones, but those were kind of the ones that are out there. But there's a total of 47. Within 9 months, they made $90 million. And there's probably almost a staff of 5 people. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think there's any industry out there that is that many people and that much profit, so to speak. It's very scary. And then I'll talk later on about it, but the ransomware is becoming worse and worse. It's not going away. Ugly situations to deal with it, and I'll kind of give my 2 cents on how to actually publicly fix that. Hopefully that would go down that road. But also another thing, and this helps out with your executive leaders, personal liability does happen. So during the acquisition from Verizon and Yahoo, they had uncovered a data breach. They also used that during the M&A acquisition to lessen the cost for Yahoo, and Verizon had a better deal. But because of that, the shareholders, it was called shareholder derivative lawsuit, basically means that the shareholders ended up holding personal liability to the executives from the people from Yahoo. So it was basically $29 million. So there's not a whole lot of cases out there, but it does happen. So it kind of reinforces that, the executive teams, they want to have that buy-in, because if you show that level of support, it helps protect them in the long run. But in general, ransomware and business email compromise are both billion-dollar industries. I would say ransomware may not be at $1 billion yet. It probably is. It's hard to track a lot of that information because it's not always out there. But it's definitely billions in damages. And then one thing I noted from just seeing the ones that do state the operational impact versus the ransomware payout, a general rule of thumb is that if you pay $4 million in ransomware, you're going to have about $40 million in damages. It's about 10 times for most of the numbers I've seen. This is all opinionated because it's not really a whole lot of detail out there about that. But that's something to think about. It's not just the payments that you normally see. It's more of the damages when it comes to that. So the cybersecurity is a super complex issue. As I'm sure everyone in this room that deals with IR, the attacker methods get more and more complex every month. I remember dealing with early ransomware, CryptoLocker in 2014, I think, somewhere around there, and I was dumbfounded how sophisticated it was. And that was just the tip of the iceberg at that time, because that's before they started doing targeting. They had people that probably actually looked at the economics of the companies and seeing how much they could ransom. It was a shotgun approach. They used a lot of action script and other things. But it was just, somebody opened up a PDF document, and then the first thing it did is it ran and looked at network map drives and encrypted all the files. But it used Tor, which was newer at that time, and it was really cool because, it sucked because seeing that stuff, and I'm like, oh crap, now I'm going to ruin the rest of my day. But at the same time, seeing the level of sophistication on using Tor, how to anonymize it, I was dumbfounded. I'm like, these guys actually are pretty smart, whoever does this. Unfortunately, they're on the bad side, but that was in 2014. Now you have groups like Ryuk that started, actually SamSam is another one, starting with probably around 2016 to more of the after 2018. But they started using more red team tactics. They're not getting to the point with nation-state sponsors with living off the land, but their attack methods are getting a lot more complex, where they're looking for vulnerabilities. They have custom tools that they exploit versus shotgun approach. They look at the economics where, okay, this company has public information that they're $1 billion in revenue. They could then ransomware for this much money, and they actually have a negotiation system. It gets really interesting with that whole thing. But the other problem, though, beyond just the fact that these attackers are getting more sophisticated, they're getting more profitable, the judicial system out there can't really agree on what's defined, and the laws can't even keep up with it. I mean, the only law that's out there is Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which means jack crap when it comes to the countries like Russia, Iran, and other countries that are outside of Interpol's jurisdiction. So, yeah, you could have Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but you're not going to arrest anybody in Russia. You have to go through the diplomatic ways, and they're probably just going to keep a blind eye because they're making profit and there's other reasons behind it. But even internally with our own lawsuits, it's really hard to justify, like, what is, I know there's all these different states that are trying to make their own mini Computer Fraud and Abuse Act type of law, and they really can't agree on it. It makes things worse, ends up kind of pissing off some companies, and they end up like thinking about leaving that area. So then they realize, okay, incorporating this law is going to hurt our state more than actually helpful. So it is a kind of a interesting thing. And when you talk to lawyers out there in the industry, most of them don't know what is like happening in the market. A lot of them are dealing with it post-mortem, and they're trying to be adaptive. And it's nothing to do against lawyers that are out there. The problem is that they don't teach this stuff in colleges, and I don't even think they teach it right now. So you could get your bar, but you won't have to know about cybercrime or incident response. Yet more and more of these lawyers are being pulled into this. And talking to some ones that are specialized in cybersecurity, none of them actually get training on it. They only get that knowledge from the fact of they're dealt with enough instances that they became kind of subject matter experts because they're able to analyze and figure it out. But there is no like playbooks around this stuff for lawyers. It's all post-mortem. And that's the kind of the scary thing is that, the people that are legally defending our country really don't know what to do. But one thing that seems to matter when it comes to kind of building a program internally in your organization, one is duty of care. That is definitely used a lot in lawsuits that are out there. And in simple terms, it just basically means executive buy-in. And I'll talk about it later on, but Cybersecurity Steering Committee is what I created in my organization. It helps create a charter saying that they have to attend this once a month, and we do many things to help kind of the organization beyond just helping them, defend against cybersecurity, but also awareness around other things too. Evidence of growth of cybersecurity program. And when I say growth, I don't mean like spend $1 million and next year spend $2 million. It's constant growth in the sense of we engineered these solutions, we did system hardening here, we did patch management, we have better procedures in there, we have better playbooks. You don't have to increase your funds to actually grow the cybersecurity program. But if you have any evidence of the program being stagnant, or maybe a lot of these the leadership from the cybersecurity teams leave and they're not able to refill that with proper staff and an incident happens, they can use that in lawsuits, and it has been shown. So that is definitely a thing that most people that run these programs, they want to make sure they show evidence of that, however you do that. And it doesn't have to be metrics. It just has to show that some growth of it, whether it be adding more tools or programs. The other thing, which isn't really used a whole lot in court cases, but I think this is something that should be done, response time relative to the industry. It's a hard number because nobody wants to publicly talk about it. And Verizon database, Verizon has a data breach response report every year. And they show kind of some numbers, which is kind of loosely opinionated. But if the industry starts taking a stance on, responding to this better, then the people like the ransomware groups will become less profitable. And if they make lawsuits to hold these companies accountable for negligence, and having a very low bar when it comes to that, I honestly think that will help kind of push that industry towards a better way of doing things. As I mentioned, executive buy-in is a huge thing. I created a cybersecurity steering committee in my organization. With that, in that committee, I don't not only just talk about things that we incorporated, new engineering, new tools, new metrics or things that are out there, but also talk about just overall like things that we're going to be pushing out there and get like pilot groups for potential operational things. Because the problem with cybersecurity tools is that some of them will require a little bit of TLC. Like your multi-factor authentication is a huge one, which I'll talk about later on. You're definitely going to have some issues around implementing that because a lot of people just don't like that extra burden. But when you look at the grand picture of it, it is an awesome win if you're able to incorporate that to the whole enterprise. The other thing is collaboration and transparency with your legal team, compliance team, and internal audit. Not all companies have dedicated teams to this. Sometimes they outsource legal. Some companies don't have internal audit. Some companies aren't really compliance driven. But if you're able to, if you have those parts of the organization, you're able to coordinate with them. They will be your biggest advocate when it comes to a lot of these issues down the road that you'll come across with the incident response. And anytime you talk to anybody like legal or compliance, they're always there to help support it. They're just as lost as everyone else out there in the industry. But if you're able to sit down with them and kind of show them some scenarios and explain why you're doing this or why we're going this approach, they never push back. And that's one thing that I think a lot of leaders in cybersecurity kind of fail on is that just take that initial step to go communicate with them and get that kind of baseline. And once you do that, it's so much easier. And then the other thing is budget smart. I've seen way too many companies that do this where they either let their vendor do the choices for them, or they spend all the money on a particular thing. Like some companies I've seen spend all their money on identity access management, which is great. You want to make sure the accounts have rotation, privilege access is done right. But at the same time, that may not matter when during somebody gets ransomware. If they get creds to an account and they're able to then create their own accounts, and have a SIM to actually detect that, putting all your money in one area is not going to help kind of resolve that. So when you build a program, and I was fortunate enough to greenfield my whole cybersecurity program. It's definitely a rarity in the industry, but even so, when you adopt a cybersecurity program, you still look at it as a holistic view and then plan on in the future what are the gaps that you're missing, and you want to make sure that that budget is properly because it's like cybersecurity is really like a human body. It's a complex organism. There's so many different things. You got all these different organs that rely on other parts. And if you don't build the program to kind of, do, which I'll talk a little more on the bigger wins, but like multi-factor, email gateway, vulnerability management, if you don't have all those different pieces done properly, it's going to bite you in the butt in the long term. The other thing is, always plan for change. Basically, when you go talk to your CFO or your other leaders in the organization, it's really hard to get additional budget. People don't realize, because I see TED Talks talking about building a cybersecurity program, and you go up them and show them here's all the risks and the impact it would cost. Generally, that doesn't work. The CFO is not going to be like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Let me go ahead and call the banks or talk to the equity partner and pull line of credit because of that. That rarely happens. You have to kind of plant those seeds and grow with it, where you have to explain the risk and maybe wait until your CFO has a particular project where he can fit that into the budget. It doesn't happen overnight, and that's the thing that a lot of people that fail when they want to build a program, they think they could talk about the security theater, all the shock and awe, and then they'll instantly get budget because of that. It rarely works that way. You got to partner with your CFO. You got to explain the risks, and if the risk happened during that, at least you have it in email format and you're able to move forward and act on it. Sometimes companies will do that where they won't spend money until post incident, and that's very common in the industry. But if you partner with your CFO and explain this, you're able to, and if you're lucky enough not to have an incident, usually at the end of the year for the budget, you're able to grow that. I was able to grow organically, but most people I know end up getting most of their budget after a major incident, which is kind of a sad state with the industry. But I can't blame them, because when you talk to the CFO, they have a set line, that they have to hit for budget. And if you cross that line, that requires them to talk to their equity partners or the banks and pull lines of credit. It's not as simple as most people think. And then when you're building your program out, always phase it out. I've seen people do this too, where they're just instantly gonna shove all the tools, buy all the tools at once. You're gonna fail because you're not gonna have the right staff. You're gonna be bothering your infrastructure team all at once. You're gonna have too many hurdles, and then it gets to the point where then you forget about these tools. I've seen a lot of companies do failed projects in the past because they tried to do all at once because a post-breach and the different teams get overwhelmed and they're not able to go back and resolve it. Another thing is, and I think this has to do with kind of SOX regulations, COVID, and a few other things, but there's a lot of barriers that I've seen in certain industries, and I'm a component of knocking down those walls. I feel like my analysts and engineers should be the same people. If they want to collaborate and do their own thing, I have no idea why that some of these companies think separation of duty is a mandatory thing. But and it does. When I say separation of duty, it's not like, separating accounts and roles and responsibility makes sense. But some of these companies view it as that analysts can't talk to engineers. They can't get on a Zoom session and show what the engineers do, and the analysts are like, oh yeah, that's definitely those alerts are my biggest problem. That is very common, and I never understood in the industry, but we really need to encourage that behavior where you have them kind of collaborate, because there is a lot of false positives in most of the tools out there, and if you're able to get rid of that stuff, your team's so much more efficient. And the other thing is, and I hate kind of the buzzwordy happy-feely, but you really want to take people on a journey. We do this all the time in my company, where I get different teams out there, like a clinical team or the network admins, and we take them and kind of collaborate with our offensive security or defensive, but we show them the realistic side. Because once you kind of walk through a scenario, what it really looks like, they stop questioning things. They're your biggest advocate. And it does take some extra time. You're taking a few hours of your day to go work with the different people out there. And you got to also retailer your terms and information to the people that may not know, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and all this stuff. But if you show that to them and walk them through them, and hey, this is why this is important. We're going to be spending some development time. We need you guys to make sure that our collaboration when it comes to user testing, you're there with us. And they'll understand and they'll agree, and then you won't have pushback. But it's very simple, but yet it's very uncommon that I've seen in the industry. I think it's just there's a overwhelming stigma of security folks that are viewed as the trolls in the basement that only come up when they want to yell at you for doing wrong. And I really want to break that in the industry. Kind of related image is a lot of people kind of talk about the problems that they want to fix and mitigate, and I never understood the pitfalls in a lot of these companies, because if you partner with your infrastructure team, you partner with development, and you kind of walk them through these scenarios, generally things will get done. But this is kind of a joke, but there's an overwhelming amount of this in the industry where people will, the old man screaming at the cloud saying, blah, 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 and then nothing gets done. But, if you collaborate, you'll end up being able to resolve most of these issues. So let's talk about the two biggest concerns in the corporations. As I mentioned already about ransomware, that is a overwhelming problem, and it's not getting better. And every time I thought about something where it's like, man, it would be horrible if they targeted people and then or use external like RDP servers and things like that, and then they end up doing it. Or it would be horrible if they start hitting VPN appliances, because PCI is all about segmentation and with multi-factor. But if you pop a VPN service, you get into their CDN network and you're able to compromise everything. And that happened. And then I was thinking, well, it will be even worse if they start exfilling data and then using that, because some people will be able to use backups. The other thing too, a lot of people don't realize when it comes to ransomware, they got the asset management down to a science. A lot of times when they compromise, they'll use like Emotet and then they'll, or KegTap or wherever the new ones are, and then they'll compromise the network, and then they'll actually start scanning and creating kind of an inventory. And what they'll do is it's kind of like I call it a go live script, but they'll get to the point where they'll know when to pull the trigger because they already got domain admin and a bunch of other stuff. They'll know when to stop the SQL servers, when to then go to the Veeam server that had the same credentials as their domain admin, and destroy all the backups and shadow copies. And that's something I'll talk about in a second. But people don't realize that you got to look at, when you build your cybersecurity program, as what the attackers really do. The other thing is business email compromise. Even though that one's less devastating when it comes to operational impact, it is extremely profitable. FBI has a report, and I think I would have to look it up, but they're in the like 20 billions of revenue since 2013, tracking all this stuff. Now, granted, there's a lot of other things that are put in those numbers for business email compromise, such as like romance schemes and whatnot. But another tactic that a lot of these people do, business email compromise, they actually will do direct deposit override. So if you have like ADP, and they'll take those credentials that they harvest and then log into those platforms and update the direct deposit. And things that I've seen from other people in the industry, they'll use like what they call mules. So essentially, they will compromise their system of where the direct deposit's been updated. It'll be sometimes like an American Express or some bank company. They'll funnel that money, and it's interesting because people don't think about it until they look at it later on. But I wouldn't be surprised it's correlated. But there's like Craigslist ads and signs on the highway like get money fast schemes. I got a feeling a lot of those go towards those business email compromise groups. And what those people are called mules, where they basically take all the money that they exfil from these companies for direct deposit overrides, and then they will say, hey, go to this bank, open up a account in the United States with your name, keep $1,000 for yourself, and then transfer $20,000 to a Nigerian bank. And then once it goes over to there, it's out of our jurisdiction. The money gets pulled instantly, and getting it back, unless FBI arrests a lot of those people and find a way to get it back, you're kind of screwed. And that's a very common thing with business email compromise. They're not just trying to take your email address and then spam emails. Their end goal is financially motivated, just like ransomware. And it's more and more financially motivated. And they got it down to more of a science. They know all the different payroll systems out there. They know how to, what types of phishing emails look more or more acceptable to people falling victim to. So when it comes to those two big concerns, and there's many other concerns when it comes to cybersecurity program, but if you talk to any type of CEO or whatnot, they're losing sleep in cybersecurity because of ransomware. They have friends that dealt with it. They see in the media. They don't want to be part of it. But the biggest fix for a lot of the stuff, and granted, it's the program's a holistic view. There's a lot of other things that are involved beyond this. But when it comes to business email compromise, two things. Email gateway and multi-factor will pretty much stop majority of that. If you're able to multi-factor enterprise-wide, the credential reuse is kind of gone. I mean, there are like these sophisticated attacks, but business email compromise groups don't do that. And the other thing, too, is that when you build this program, you're not building it 100% protect you from everything. You're trying to be the lowest threshold. If you're dealing with a ransomware group and you're able to stop them once, they're going to move on. They're not going to be persistent. They're going to be like, well, this is too much effort. I could go do this other company that doesn't have a security team and get a lot more money, and I'm going to move to the next target. So that's what you got to think about, is how the attacker does stuff, and also the financial gains around it. But email gateway is a great thing. I was talking to one of my buddies over there about that a few minutes ago. But when it comes to that email gateway, there's many different ways of doing it. But the amount of effort you have when you set it up improperly, or you have kind of a worse solution, equates to a lot of time on the analyst. And if you're able to engineer a solution properly, it really helps. And it cuts down a lot of the incident response because you're able to block it before that happens. And another thing is asset patch and vulnerability management. Now, a lot of people out there will have different tools like Qualys, Tenable, and Rapid7 Expose for their vulnerability management, which is definitely needed in a mature program. But if your organization's able to have a team dedicated for asset management and has a good team that does like SCM patches, that is way better than a vulnerability management tool. It just comes down to you need to have, if you do have that vulnerability management tool, you need to have that collaboration with your infrastructure team. And if you don't have that, you're not going to do anything. I've seen too many people where they just keep handing them reports and nothing gets done. And I'm like, well, then have you sat down with them and talked them through why this is a concern? Have you got your red team to show them how ugly this looks like when it happens? No, it never happens. But so if you're spending all this money on vulnerability management and you're not getting anywhere, just get rid of it and then work with your infrastructure team. You probably have better results that way. But ultimately, that is what helps a lot with this stuff. The other thing is the EDR solution. Now, in here, I actually do not have SIM, which there's a reason I have not in there. SIM is extremely important. But EDR is something that there's no really a regulation out there that mandates it. And it's definitely one of the bigger wins when it comes to that stuff, especially ransomware, because they get a lot more sophisticated. And EDR products basically look at the child-parent process and how they execute. And especially when you get into more of the sophisticated stuff like living off the land, where they're using native Windows tools to laterally remove, you can't get that with a SIM or any other AV solution. There's no solution other than EDR that will fix a lot of that stuff. The other thing is, properly configured backups. Everyone talks about backups. People say, oh, you need to have off-site backups. What it comes down to is you got to think how the attacker works. There's a, and I'll post it on Twitter at the end if you look it up. But there's a video of a school that's out there that dealt with ransomware that publicly talked about it, and their VM was impacted. And what it came down to is that the password was the same there. And the worst part is they had off-site backups of the VM, but when they ransomware them, they did it during the time that it was syncing to the off-site. So the off-sites got corrupted. So what it comes down to is the easiest fix is don't have the same credentials. Work with your people on the infrastructure team that does the backups. Let them know that they could use a password utility and keep it separate and not on the same domain too. And that's generally how a lot of that stuff will be fixed. Or if it's on a data center infrastructure that's maintained by something else like VMware and they're able to destroy the VMs, put that into your scope. But as long as you're able to segment that off as a certain part and then not have the same credentials that they might harvest during a ransomware attack, that is your proper way of doing the backups. You don't have to have like tape backups. You gotta go off-site and stuff like that. You just have to think smart when you're doing the backups. The other thing is system hardening. That is a huge thing when it comes to especially Windows products on lessening the attack surface. That's one of the biggest ones that I've seen recently because we do red team engagements every year or adversary simulations. And going from a few years ago to now with additional system hardening, the time for the attack lessens a lot. It is a huge win. And a lot of the stuff out there actually don't impact the organization. I'm sure one of my coworkers will do a talk on this eventually because we spent a lot of time on this. But it's really not that bad. And I think more organizations need to spend time on it. Like your biggest wins are going to be like disabling broadcast protocols like LMNR, NetBIOS, WPAD, other things like that. The other thing is, like I mentioned, cadences with your infrastructure team. You want to make sure that you keep in sync with them on that. And then the other biggest win would be you obviously want to have an incident response team. And some companies aren't that large, and your incident response team is the infrastructure team. But as long as they have playbooks involved in how to resolve that stuff, that is a huge win. And the other thing is get your basics done first. Don't spend money on like the new fancy user behavior analytics, SOAR products when you don't have a SIM, when you don't have asset management. Yeah. And it's funny because like asset management is always hard and every company gets it wrong. If you spend more time on that and make sure that they're in your platform of patch management or platform of your security tools, those are going to be your biggest wins. And if you're going to be dumping all this money in user behavior analytics and you can't even get your asset management done, how do you create a defined list when it comes to user behavior? Another thing that I've been seeing this on Twitter a lot lately, and I want to just kind of publicly state this because I think this is something that the industry needs to kind of say. Victim shaming on companies and people, no matter if their posture is good or bad, is not right. You should not do that. And the other thing is that a lot of people think that ransomware is like, oh, just throw MFA, you fix ransomware. The groups are super sophisticated. If they spend enough time targeting you, they're going to get you. That's the biggest problem with these things. It's not as cut dry a solution. So I just want to say that, hands down, I would hire a high school dropout who dealt with ransomware than a PhD in cybersecurity who never dealt with an incident. And that's something that kind of shows, because I run a cybersecurity program at a larger hospital. That shows that it doesn't matter what certification degree you get. When it comes to living the experience at that moment, it is way more valuable. And for people out there to publicly say that, oh, he was part of Equifax during this incident, you don't know what they were doing, and you can't just put a blanket statement blaming them that, oh, they're going to be crappy because it comes from Equifax. So, and hands down, if this guy was part of Equifax dealing with the incident at that time and discovered it, I would hire him way more than anybody else in the industry when it comes to finding resumes. Yeah. So the other thing is, like I said, ransomware operators are getting more and more sophisticated. The only thing they haven't done yet, which I'm going to be sad when I mention this and they end up doing it, is living off the land techniques that a lot of the nation-state sponsors or your APT groups or whatever you want to call them do. Like I said, the initial compromise, so like the initial email, and a lot of times the initial compromise are actually credential theft that look like BEC, and they actually have been linking a lot of these credential theft sites to particular ransomware groups, and then from there they will deploy it on their they'll get in the VPN and log into the network and deploy things. But from the initial compromise to the go live, where they're basically shutting down the whole network, encrypting everything, it got down to the point where it's less than 5 hours. And if you talk to anybody in IT to actually go into a company and discover all assets in 5 hours, I mean, good luck. Yet these ransomware groups got that down to a science. So I'm not saying anything, but if a company from Ukraine or Russia builds an asset management software, I'll probably invest in their stock. But it is something that it's scary that how these adversaries do it better than large corporations. So as I mentioned, a lot of these ransomware groups, this email compromise, they're outside of Interpol. Interpol is basically, I hate to say it, world police in a way. They kind of, I think it's part of the United Nations, but they basically create, to be part of the IMF, you kind of have some collaboration with that stuff, and they're able to go into those countries and enforce law outside of their standard federal law. Most of these solutions to fix ransomware are difficult. I've seen a lot of things thrown out there, such as block payments to these groups, put additional sanctions on these countries. And it's also really hard to say block payments, because then they may switch from Bitcoin to Monero or some type of cryptocurrency that doesn't have the ability to track. And I don't even know if the government can truly enforce blocking payments to these ransomware groups. Yet alone, the other problem is that if you get ransomware and you can't pay to get your data back, some of these companies will fold. Though my suggestion to fix a lot of this ransomware, because if you deal IR, you know that stuff is getting worse and worse every year. Give companies a cybersecurity stimulus check. I mean, obviously, companies will have different. Like you'll be a larger check for a company in the billions versus a company that's mom and pop shop. But provide that to provide better cybersecurity tools. And if they get ransomware when they file their taxes and they pay for the ransom, then they will have to pay that stimulus check back. That provides incentives, because then it gives you the capability for these organizations to actually build that cybersecurity program organically versus post-mortem after ransomware. And when they're doing post-mortem, they're already lost and they need the data and they're paying for the fees. But if you give the companies the opportunity to build it earlier, then it's an easy win, and hopefully that will kind of lessen that threshold. Other than that, it's going to be like, well, maybe let some companies fold or go to war with Russia. I don't know what the solution to that problem would be, but there's not really an easy solution, and it's going to get worse and worse. So let's talk about regulations. So who here knows all these terms? I got a lot of acronyms up there. OT networks. Who's familiar with that? Any industrial people? All right. HIPAA with 2 A's. Stressing the 2 A's because it's Accountability Act, not, I always pronounce it to some people like HIPAA because it's very common that they get that wrong. But EPHI is the thing. CDE, who's familiar with the term CDE? So that's part of the payment processing industry. So that's basically saying that you have a separate network where you do transaction processing. And then SOX, separation of duty. So all these are concepts that are created that help in certain aspects, but honestly probably create more problems in the long run. When your compliance kind of puts things into a bucket, you're gonna not look at it as a holistic view, and you're end up gonna be just worried about your CDE network only, and that CDE network is controlled by a VPN appliance that you don't patch, and then that becomes an issue. I build my programs as a holistic view because you got to look at it as the whole thing. I mean, you could constantly do segmentation checks. You could constantly do other aspects of it. But ultimately, there's going to be an end user that could be compromised to deal with that stuff. You need to build the program as a very holistic view to help out with all those scenarios. You can't just put that in that bucket. And I think the industry as a whole has been doing kind of a bad job of encouraging that behavior versus just look at what the attackers do and really just build the program around that. But ultimately, if you build your security program around like like OT stuff or other things out there where it's just strictly kind of more perimeter defense or just separate buckets, I'm a firm believer that the program will fail more likely because the complexity of a lot of these networks, the use of a lot of these tools that we're going to be using cloud-based services, you're constantly poking holes in the firewall. And the attacker methods of lateral movement is becoming more and more dominant. So the concept of perimeter defenses and putting things in buckets just doesn't work that well. So generally, when you build the program, you want to build security with security in mind. If you build it with compliance in mind, then you're not going to build a proper program. If you build with security in mind, you'll naturally just become compliant because if you do enough in that program, you won't have to worry about checking a box for is it HIPAA or is it PCI. If you build it properly, you're going to just automatically hit that checkbox. And if not, you're going to have most of those checkboxes filled, and it's going to be easy to then add on to it. And I mean, you have all these companies out there like Equifax is PCI, that's a name that they throw out there a lot, Target, stuff like that. They follow the regulations. They get their return of compliance. And PCI, I'm more fond of due to the fact that they require like a QSA, PCI level 1, where you do enough transaction processing. They require a QSA to evaluate controls. Now, it's a little subjective and biased because when you deal with QSAs, you might have one that has a network admin background or one that has a SIM background. And they tend to focus more on that stuff. But at least they have a third party coming in there to help evaluate it versus you're not forced to by these other regulations to do that. But ultimately, all these places that are known with these regulations where they get that return of compliance every year, they still get ransomware. So it doesn't really matter. And that's why you need to really kind of stop ignoring the regulations. Obviously, you need to do it because that's required. But you need to look at it more of an attacker standpoint and how to build that. And the other thing is misinterpretation of regulations. As I mentioned earlier, the whole separation of duty when it comes to engineers and analysts, SOX is stated for financially significant applications. I hear that a lot where people are like, oh, you need to separate the duty from the engineers and analysts because of separation of duty. Is your SIM a financially significant application? The answer is no. And if it is, then you really need to clean up your logs because that's really weird you're doing it that way. So, I think that, putting those barriers, and I think COVID kind of started a lot of that kind of framework around that. Putting those barriers are just going to create more and more problems. When you're dealing with incident response, anybody that's dealing with that stuff, and you're on ground zero when it happens, nobody cares about barriers. Everyone wants to get it done now. So those walls just magically disappear. Why can't those walls disappear at an earlier time is the way I look at it. So when you're building a program, plan in phases, show progress. That helps with that duty of care, that growth patterns. I'm fond of metrics of engineering. not metrics of like my ID or IPS dropped 5 million port scans. Cool, it's been dropped. Why are we even looking at it? That's the way I look at it. I'm like, I don't care about all these BS metrics, but I do care about the engineering metrics. Are you able to deploy more system hardening? Are you able to get patching to a certain level? Are you able to engineer your email gateway to block more stuff? Those really matter because that's the realistic side. Are you able to incorporate another tool to encourage some type of better behavior? Are you able to do multi-factor across the enterprise? Those matter. The other thing is, and I haven't seen a whole lot of people do that, and shout out to some of the sponsors here. They do this stuff all the time, both the advisory. My advice isn't the best in the world. There's people out there that do this for a living. But on top of that, there's companies out there that'll do adversary simulations. And that's one of the things that I really love to show those metrics of showing when somebody comes in for the first pen test to down the road after you do system hardening, patching, vulnerability scanning, that path of were they able to compromise early on versus were we able to stop them later on? That metrics through simulation is not really common that I've seen a lot of the other security officers out in the industry, but it is a very valuable thing because that's the closest you can get to showing that are we ready to be dealing with ransomware. And like I said, it's based around those type of current attack methods, whether it be dealing with ransomware, business email compromise. These adversary simulations will do that exact thing. The other thing, it's been a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and not to say anything wrong with Mitre. Mitre is an amazing framework. It goes very in depth on the actual landscape of all the different types of things out there. It's like I hate it's kind of used as a buzzword now. It's like the whole Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain type of thing, where now Mitre is the new kind of terminology. It's great, but when you're a company less than $1 billion in revenue and you're going through a spreadsheet of 100 rows and columns to talk about are we protecting against passive reconnaissance, which you can't. There's no such thing to protect against that. But when you build your program out, start smaller. Think about the kind of what the attackers do. And I'll actually open up the questions after this, but I want people to argue with this right here. Let me know if there's anything on here that is not how you would resolve something through incident response. You have exploit, which is basically getting shell on a box or whatnot. And then post-exploit, which will be internal reconnaissance, which is basically also lateral movement. Privilege escalation, persistence, and then obviously your end goal, which will be either exfil or operational impact. I know Mitre is very large and has like a lot of subgroups in there for that, but let me know if there's anything that you could think that's outside of this picture when it comes to how you would resolve an incident response. Granted, there's like I said, passive reconnaissance. I'm not going to see who's Googling me. I don't have that data, but I will know somebody exploits. And port scanning may be needed, but it's kind of a nuisance. Everyone does it, and there's so many different companies that just scan all the time. This is really how your incident response team should look at it. And then the last, I didn't have enough time for this conference. This was a little bit of a pop-up, but I will be putting together a concept. It's called Get Gooder. It's just more of my distaste to a lot of the compliance that are out there because they build it with usually people that are maybe politically motivated, or I swear like PCI Council has a thing about TLS for some reason. Like, I can't remember the last time a data breach happened because somebody used TLS 1.0, yet they don't really care about SQL injection as much. Obviously they do web app scans part of it, but like that's where most of the stuff happens. So I got a feeling somebody like at one of these load balancer companies wants to upsell that. But all these compliance frameworks that are out there, they don't really wrap around what a sophisticated attacker will do. So I'll eventually, this just came from like a whiteboarding session me and my coworkers were talking about. I want to build a framework like what people look at corporate security, like, employment litigation sometimes, e-discovery, when it comes to that stuff, using a security team for that. But, the corporate security side, whether regulations or your legal team reaching out to you about that. And then on the right side is the malware groups, your business email compromise groups, state sponsors, ransomware groups, and the types of methods that you have. And in the middle is your corporate environment. You'll have like your laptops. Well, as DNS logs, will it protect you against ransomware groups? Will help kind of detect against ransomware groups. And I want to break that on more of an open source holistic view. It's going to be kind of like either a mind map or just a really ugly spreadsheet, which is probably like another Mitre version. And hopefully somebody makes fun of me for being a little verbose on it. But either way, I want to create a platform that kind of creates a baseline of the realistic side of these attacker groups and the individual like items and how effective they are, whether like understanding parent-child process with like EDR or sysbon, something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and running into, I think, close to an hour, open up questions. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter. My handle is Alex_S_Cod. But go ahead and open up questions, or if somebody wants to yell at me saying that, no, there's more stuff to that than for instant response, open the floor for that. Lady in the front, who is a great inspiration to the InfoSec community. And I'm glad to meet her in person one day. Okay. Oh, yeah. Probably should have thought that through. Well, so I tried doing the sticky tape because it worked, and then after writing it, fell down, and then life got busy, so I'm like, whatever. I'm just going to take a photo of it for now.
I do like just the progression.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to not have that up anymore. Thank you.
Does it get good, or does it stand for something? Or is it just
Yes. Nope. It is gathering information to guarantee the underdevelopment of risk.
Holy crap.
Yeah. I wanted a kind of a catchy phrase.
Of course. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
It could be a government program.
Oh, God. Please, no. No. My goal is to build a platform around that security vendors could use that as an effective rate, because Mitre is great, but it's geared towards APT groups. It's not a more of a holistic view of effectiveness on tools. Oh, go ahead. But Rocky over there is disagreeing with me, which he's correct. He uses Mitre a lot more than I do. I'm just more looking at it as the nitty-gritty of, if I'm going to be getting an EDR tool, what does it all do and the effectiveness around it. And yeah, you could match that with Mitre. Some of them do that. It gets a little convoluted. I wanted something kind of very agnostic and open when it comes to that. But Rocky, we'll talk after this. I know you'll drill me on that stuff. And again, nothing to do wrong with Mitre. I just think that when you're trying to build a program out, especially organizations less than $1 billion in revenue, it gets really complex. And I'm the type of person that loves the verbose. I mean, when I talk sometimes, some people say, instead of TAC VVV, just do TAC V, because that's too much information. But I think Mitre is kind of too much of a hurdle initially, unless you have, I guess, some organizations help you out with that. So I wouldn't know who would do that, though. But yeah. But there are, like you said, there are companies that do help out with it. Shout out to Rocky over there. So
Rocky agrees now.
Partially. We have our agreement and disagreements, but I think we come across the same exact concept. It's very hard to get as an entry level, and that's where I'm going with this. Is that start with smaller, go bigger if you need to. Any other questions?
So
Sir.
Does that mean, to make it for the people that understand Mitre better, you're going to map this to Mitre?
The question was, to make Mitre better, should I map this? So make it more convoluted? Maybe. I don't know. This was literally a random idea I thought about before COVID. Life got busy, but I definitely want to circle back. I'm full of openness when it comes to critiquing it. I may build it, and people will be like, this is crappy, and then get rid of it. But I think that the biggest problem is that when you're an engineer trying to build a program and look at all the different tools out there, it's not really cut and dry, like, will this protect me against ransomware? Will this protect me against business email compromise? And that's the reason why I was thinking about building this platform. Will this help me with host-based forensics? Will this help with employment litigation or insider threats? There's no platform out there that really kind of looks at that as a holistic view, and that's why I was going to build that. Go ahead.
So it would be like a CIS controls to NIST as like CIS to Mitre, like simpler?
Kind of. He's saying if it's CIS to Mitre,
CIS
like
to NIST.
CIS,
A lot of people
yeah.
want to do the NIST framework, but they do CIS controls first, right? It's like it all
Yeah.
maps at some point to simpler to understand,
Yeah.
simpler to comprehend.
But it's more of it maps towards the person that has the budget and buying the tools. There's nothing out there that I see that does that, and that's why I want to build it. But I want to keep it agnostic and open because, like, you could say EDR product. Well, I don't like that. I'd rather say parent-child process, validation and prevention. Does it have the option to look at command line parameters, things like that, and how effective it is when it comes to Ryuk ransomware or things like that. I want to kind of map that in the sense of if I'm going to be buying these tools, is there something out there that I could kind of leverage and also help improve the people making these tools because now they're not just creating a vague concept of this protects against this. It's a better metric to kind of gear around that. All right. Any other questions? Oh gosh, he asked, will it be a compliance framework? I will have it as Mitre attack isn't compliance, so it'll be kind of similar to that. It'll be like a model that you can leverage. I will obviously, if it's an open source project, I'll let the community kind of yell at me and help contribute, but I'm never going to make it something where somebody's going to be like, oh, you need to do it this way. It'll be kind of a loose guideline that hopefully will work, and if it does work, then you'll base it off of it. But it's not going to be something that I hope companies say that you need to follow this. It'll be kind of annoying if it was. I'm anti-against that. Any other questions? All right, cool. Well, I guess then I'll segue into the second part, talk about network forensics, my other talk. So, yep. I'll make this one quicker because my voice is dying. I generally don't talk that long in a row. So I want to do a quick kickoff of network forensics. Some of this stuff is going to be pretty elementary, like some one-on-one stuff that if you've done this stuff before, it may bore you a little bit. But most importantly, though, before everyone kind of gets distracted to leave, downstairs we are hosting a network forensic village. We're doing a CTF style this year. So there will be questions on there, like 101 questions, 201, like what is the utility, like a 101 question is, what is the utility for Windows to test ICMP traffic? Go ahead. We'll give this answer to everyone. It'll be a freebie. Come on. Yeah, I think you're trying to speaking up. Go ahead. Go ahead, say it. Yep, exactly. Ping. So that's a free one for everyone. So there'll be a list of questions, and we'll be opening up shortly the lab environment, which is going to be a Molek box. The Molek box also has Suricata. That box digested the IDS alerts, so you actually see it in the actual Molek web interface. You're more than welcome to download the full packet capture and use anything that I talk about on this talk, but feel free. I got some of my crew down there, able to help out with that, and they'll be able to get you signed up on the CTF. And Rocky will be handing out gift cards for first and second place. So there will be prizes associated to whoever wins. So first, on the network forensic side, the biggest problem when it comes to understanding networking is there's I'll just kind of skip ahead. There's two different models out there. There's the TCP IP model and the OSI model. A lot of the people teach the OSI model, and I think it's a great thing. But when it comes to like Wireshark and how the packet's encapsulated, in general, it is a little more convoluted when it comes to the what's the difference between session, presentation, and application. So this talk is going to be more towards the DoD model. But essentially, when you're sending a piece of traffic, like an ARP or a request, it's going to have the kind of layers of protocols that it evaluates before it gets to the router. So it starts with your MAC address and an ARP request. And then that MAC address, it's your default gateway. So your configured device will have a default gateway. And inside of that default gateway, we'll have the ability to take apart the packet saying that this is my destination. And then it'll say, okay, here's the actual gateway with that MAC address. Go talk to them. And then from there, it'll take that traffic and hop between next router and next router to when you get to the destination. So the packet information has, like I said, the MAC address. It has the source and destination. And then it'll also have kind of some parameter options, whether it be in the TCP side, like if it's been acknowledged, or if on the UDP side there's no session handling. It's just a shotgun approach. But essentially, when you send a piece of information, it's going to have all the different parts of the protocol: the IP header information, the port information, whether it be like TCP where it's a stateful protocol, and if it was accepted or dropped, or in other parameters. And then inside that part, at the very bottom, you have TCP data, which basically goes into the protocol level, and that's very important when it comes to network forensics. And I'll talk about that in a second. But all those protocols are usually designed by an organization, usually the Internet Task Force, ITF, and what's called RFC. They have a request for comment, where they have the ability to create that protocol standard. So if you're sending email, you're not sending your own version of SMTP. You're sending a part of that protocol that everyone agrees on, and that's how pretty much the Internet works. But usually these protocols were designed in the 60s before the internet, like FTP, Telnet, things like that. Well, not 60s, early on in the 70s and whatnot. But they weren't built around the concept of large-scale internets, attackers, red team and blue team. Most of those protocols are kind of added on afterwards, or they're designed differently to have kind of subcomponents to help out with that. Where I'm getting with that is that some of these protocols will have what is called information disclosure. And in my previous talk about basically the system hardening, when you're getting rid of LMNR or NetBIOS, inside of those protocols, you have the ability for like host name information. So in the lab downstairs, there'll be some protocols out there, like Kerberos, for example. You could actually look in the actual Kerberos data packet and see the user that was associated to that IP address, because at one point he got a Kerberos ticket. And that'll help kind of build that picture. So if you're dealing with like postmortem incident response and all you have is packet captures, even though that the host level information is not there, you could still tell who the person was and what IP address he had. And then also, you could break apart some of the protocols, whether it be like an HTTP request, where you pull the file out and see what type of file it was, where the attacker was. So I'm actually not going to go over this a little bit too much, but what I could do is to make it kind of a little bit more easier. If anybody wants downstairs to be partake in the Network Forensic Village, I could actually go ahead and show these slides. But in these slides, I do go over like the concept of Wireshark. If you're not familiar with it, I don't want to bore too many people. But the ability to actually go in there, export, filter off the Wireshark. So I have the ability to follow a TCP stream. So in TCP, it's session. So you're able to follow that whole packet all the way through. And then in there, I also have the ability to export objects. The file, so you can do analyzing of it. Network Miner is another tool. It's kind of like the way I explained it, it's cheat mode, where you could just kind of open it up and have a bigger picture. It's a little bit easier. Wireshark is going to obviously get you a lot more on the low level and the full big picture. But if you just want a quick answer, sometimes throw out their Network Miner will get that quicker than anything else. And then in there, I also talk about how pulling files off a Network Miner. Additionally, you could use Linux utilities out there. There's other like Windows utilities too, to basically pull the information. Every file on the network will have a header, and that header sometimes are like your extension could be .png, but the actual header will be like, I'll have MZ in there, and it'll actually be an executable. So sometimes attacker groups will do that where they do obfuscation by hiding in plain sight. So if you want downstairs, the CTF, and I'll have this up on the screen down there, there's the wireless password for it. The CTF server, there's about 20 questions, about 25-ish. And then, like I said, first prizes and first and second prize will get gift cards. It is actual malware that we generated off of it. So if you're running this and you're not comfortable, let us know. But ideally run that in a sandbox. If you have like a Windows box, you could run Hyper-V Sandbox natively on it. Or if you want, just run it in a tool to analyze it. I'll have this slide up downstairs if you guys want to reference that. Feel free to ask any questions down there. We want people to participate. Some people may be foreign to what's called MOLEC. I think the new name's Archemy. We'll help you walk you through that and kind of get the experience on that. That's one of the things that I want to stress is that there's a lot of CTS out there at conferences that are more geared towards red team, but there's not a whole lot out there that are blue team focused. And I think that's a very high need. When it comes to the industry, you're generally going to have like one red team and 7 blue teams and maybe some compliance people in the security program. The blue team is always needed. You're going to have a lot more. And especially if you're doing instant response, I don't think we could pull enough people out there to help fulfill the overwhelming growing of ransomware. So, I'm doing this event here for the network forensic. Down the road, I'm hoping to do more of an elaborated blue team, including Sysmon, using ELK to look at logs and actually simulate a full attack in there and kind of do a CTF style answer those questions. But again, downstairs, feel free to hit me up and we'll definitely help you out through that.